So good afternoon, everybody, everyone that's joined this session. We are going to take a look together at the Maths GCSE papers from the summer. The agenda as standard, so those of you that have attended sessions before, you'll know that there's a general format and we try to make sure all areas are covered. So I will take you through our entry data. To start with, so you can see just how many students sat the exams this summer. We'll then have a look at some crossover questions. I'll pick up on key topics as we go through. We identify some post-16 key topics if you're a post-16 teacher. We have run a separate network event for post-16 performance analysis. The link for that recording is now available. I'm sure that you'll be able to find it on my Twitter and also on the Maths Emporium, but I'll make a little nod in case you've missed that. We've also got a dive into the crossover questions, so those questions at the end of the higher tier and the end of the foundation tier and the beginning of the higher tier. We'll look at those and we'll compare the performance by grade and have a look at how students performed across both of the papers. We'll then take a bit of a further dive into that foundation tier. We always like to see the start of the papers, those first 5 1 markers, and how well the students got off to their accessible starts at the beginning. And then we'll take a dive into the questions that we think performed particularly well and those that didn't, and what we can do about that to make sure that next year's cohort are not making the same mistakes. We'll do the same again with the higher tier. We'll look into some key topics that were successful or are making progress since the birth of the specification. And we'll have a look at particular topics that are not faring so well and need our attention. We'll also take a look at the examiner keynotes. Now, of course, the examiner reports are out, but they are hefty documents. So my job is to help you save some time, and I've picked out some very key brief notes from the summaries. And then we'll have a whistle-stop tour through the grade boundaries. Of course, I'm sure you know them off the top of your head, but we'll take a look at those and then I'll signpost you to some support and other materials that might be useful to you as we embark upon a new year. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the entry data. So quite staggering, a huge number of students took the exams this summer. So 523,000 of those students sat their papers with Edexcel this summer, a total number of 878,000. Get that number right, actually. So over 500,000 students sat with Edexcel. I've done the tiering breakdown, so a 54% and 45% rounded split between the foundation tier and higher tier. And you can see the other boards as well that obviously students can sit their GCSE with. There's a little graphic on the side so you can see just how popular Pearson Edexcel is, and we are the board of choice for GCSE Maths. There are the All England figures as well at the bottom. So over 800,000 students just in England alone sitting their GCSE this summer. Significant increase in the post-16 entries, around 19% increase this summer. Just for those of you that wanted to know that piece of information. Right, so we're going to look at some crossover questions, and as any key topics pop up, which I mentioned in the beginning around post-16, we have those 28 key topics that were identified by post-16 students as really fundamental and core to the progress of any resit students. So we try to highlight them where we see them, but they also are in there's a shorter network that we did on post-16 only. So if you want more information or more insights into the post-16 performance this summer, please do take a look at the recording that's in the Emporium. Okay, let's have a look at some crossover questions then. So these are normally the last few questions on the foundation paper, with the exception this year, it's usually the last 2 maybe didn't cross over between the 2, but most of the time they're the last 7 questions or so, and the first 7 questions. So here are the questions for paper 1s. So there were 26 marks available on both of the papers, and what I've done here is picked out in pink, so the column in pink will show you the mean percentage score. Of course, we're going to see foundation students gaining fewer marks as they reach the end of the paper, and of course we'll expect the higher tier paper to be getting off to a flying start on these first questions. So you can see the mean percentage scores. The comparisons are quite stark between the two, but that's expected. However, what I always find really interesting is just to have a look at the try and weighing up a grade 5 foundation student with a grade 5 higher student. And of course, there is an algorithm which is test equating, and that's used by each exam board to ensure that there's complete comparability between the tiers. So you've probably heard us mention before about the chained equipercentile algorithm. You can find it on the DFE website if you'd like to know more about how that's applied. But basically, it just uses the performance on these common items, and it will generate the equated pair of marks that represent that same standard across both of the tiers. So effectively, we shouldn't feel or weigh a grade 5 foundation student any differently than a grade 5 higher tier student. So you can see they performed pretty comparably, which is good to see. So where I've highlighted in green, you can see that the foundation tier green just beats the foundation tier grade 5 just beats the higher tier grade 5 and the grade 4 as well. And you see they even each other out, and the differences are minimal. But I think it's nice. I used to do this with my students in the classroom and show them, you're just as good as a higher tier grade 5, for example, when some of those students in the foundation tier were feeling a bit despondent. Let's have a look at paper 2. So again, it's always around 25 or 26 marks, around the 75 mark in total across the 3 papers. So again, we saw questions 20 to 26, which was 1 to 7 on the higher and foundation tier. So again, you can see, we'll talk about this in a minute in the first 5 questions, but the performance of students kind of feel differently in their confidence levels, but they'll come out and always say, paper 2 was harder than paper 1, or paper 3 was easier than paper 2, for example, and they get this idea of how they feel that one paper was harder than the other. But as teachers, we like to have a look and say, well, actually, what is the mean score? And you can do all of this digging using these skills maps that you can find on the Maths Emporium. You could get lost in the data, it's quite fun, but you can have a look at the bottom of each paper, and you can see statistically which papers scored better. You don't tend to find anything too significantly stark, but it's good to marry up the sentiment with the statistics. So we will pick out some of these questions because there's some stark realizations here that foundation tier students, for example, in question 24C, there was a 9% mean average score in comparison to 61% on the higher tiers. That's quite a staggering difference. And I think as teachers, we always want to ask that, why is that? What's happening there? I think we would know that not many foundation tier students will concentrate too much on solving quadratic equations, or teachers might not spend as much time on that, trying to focus on the key skills. So that may be one of the reasons. But we'll dig into a couple of these questions that I found quite interesting, and also questions that students found really interesting as per social media on the days of the exams. So paper 3, there were 25 marks available, and these were the actual last questions, so 22 to 28 on the foundation and 1 to 7 on the higher. And you can see again that the grade 4 higher tier candidates performed, I say better. Again, they're equal in weighting. The algorithm that's in place makes sure that those standards are comparable, but you can see that the differences are very minimal, but it's interesting to have a look at those. Okay, should we have a look at some of these questions then? So the first one I wanted to pick up on was from paper 1, and it was the ratio in context question. So on exam day, I like to keep an eye on social media to get the sentiment from teachers and students. And I kept seeing, I don't get to see the papers until the same time you do. And so I kept seeing all of these social media posts about jars, and I thought, what on earth is going on here? And then once I saw the paper, this question was clearly what they were talking about. So it's that ratio in context, isn't it? So it's being able to apply those fundamental skills of ratio, fractions of amounts, percentages, etc., but rolling them up into that worded AO3 problem. So there's a lovely little tweet there from a student discussing, no context, in inverted commas, and some others, which make me laugh on the day. I like to see what the students have to say, and I'm always fascinated at how well they remember the ins and outs of the questions when they come out of the exams. Anyway, statistically, I've picked this out because this had a 17% success rate of this question, and there were clear defined outcomes between grades 3, 4 and 5. So we always like to think about the differentiators. You can usually tell by looking at the performance of questions when there is a significant jump between a particular grade, so a grade 3 student and a grade 4 student, for example. It's clear to say these types of questions, therefore, are the grade 4 indicators. To be able to get a grade 4 or be a grade 4 student, you're going to have to be very good at these type of questions. And that's what we saw here. But the defined jumps happened between 3 and 4 and 5. By that, I mean the average score on this question, so 5 marks available, a grade 3 student got an average of 0.71. A grade 4 student got an average of 1.42, and a grade 5 student got an average of 2.43. So there were real significant jumps. And I think that is just down to how far the students are getting through the questions. So the grade 3 students are being able to maybe access the 3/8 of the 400 jars. And then the grade 4 students are being able to apply maybe one of those ratios, or trying to compare the 2 ratios. And that's from reading through examiner reports and having our examining team feedback sessions. We've heard that students just really struggle with that comparable 2 ratio problem, the corresponding parts from the 2 ratios. So the correct process, of course, was to find the 3/8 of the 400, and that was the mark that was awarded most commonly. So as feedback to students, if you're using this question as kind of temperature gauging their progress over the next coming months, maybe for mocks or preparation for the summer, students do need to work on that comparative of two ratios. Where the candidates did find that there were 30 empty small jars, they then were using the incorrect proportion to get the percentage. So they were doing it out of 150 rather than the 400. So examiners reported that that was a stumbling block, where students did actually manage to get them their way through, but then found the proportion, they used the wrong denominator for the proportion at the end. I've put at the bottom of each of these crossover questions the average marks for a foundation tier student and a higher tier student, so you can see the difference at the bottom. But that was one of my favorite questions to dig into on the crossover. The next one I wanted to pick up on was on paper 2, and we've talked about product to prime factors a number of times over the past couple of years when looking at performance in live series. And I wanted to have a bit of a celebration on this one, because not only have we mentioned it before, and I talked last year about, the students, they clearly know what they're doing. This is a very familiar question to them. It's a familiar skill that we see quite often, but the frustrating thing can be for us as teachers is when they don't present their answer as a product of the prime factors. So I've picked out some exemplars that I went through, and you can see Well, I'll leave it up to you, because you might want to share this slide with your students. One of those is correct. We all know which one that is, but you might be, you might want to put that up as a starter, and or a traffic light kind of question, and ask them which one they think is right and which one they think is wrong. But I wanted to celebrate that this performance for this type of question this year was our best yet. We have improved on these types of questions year on year. Now, we went, so if we go kind of 3 assessments back, so I'm not saying 3 years, we don't know that these types of questions come up every year, but the first time this was assessed was a 46% success rate. Then it was 49% last year, and then this year it was 56%. So we are creeping up slowly in the right direction, but it's such a successful outcome at the foundation tier. The higher tier, the mission now, everybody, the challenge is to get 100% of our higher tier students getting both marks. So the higher tier have gone from 93% to 97% to 98%. So it'll be amazing. I don't think we'll ever see 100%, human error does creep in, but 98% success rate on this question, and you can see that by the average marks. So 1.29 out of 2 on the foundation tier and 1.95 on the higher. The common problems on that drop of that last mark, of course, is not listing them properly, not using the product, using the sum, or just picking out the wrong numbers, not finishing it completely, like you can see on one of those. But factor trees are the way forward. Students feel really comfortable with using the trees. It's just that identifying presenting it in the correct way at the end, which can cause the stumbling blocks for some. So congratulations to everyone that has been hammering product to prime factors in their classrooms over the past year, because that's a 10 percentage point increase on the foundation tier, which is celebrated, and 5 percentage points on the higher tier. So big pat on the back for all of that hammering home products of prime factors. So I'm watching for next year now. We don't want to let that slip. We want to keep the standards going. The other question I wanted to pick out, unfortunately, again, was product to prime ratio and context. Sorry. So this was on paper 2. Sorry to pick out 2 on the same paper, but I wanted to pick out this one again because we saw the use of ratio. Again, we're not comparing 2 ratio parts here, but we've got fractions, we've got percentages, and I think students are struggling, particularly, as you can see from the average marks, they're struggling particularly on the foundation tier, just to try and unpick exactly what the question is asking. However, this was a much better approach question, multi-step ratio question, than we've seen previously. There was a 25% success rate on foundation tier, and it was a clear grade 4 differentiator. The average score for a grade 3 student was 0.86 marks, and for a grade 4 student was 1.80 marks. So we're seeing good progress. We're seeing that resilience that we've been talking about over the past couple of years, students really giving it a go. The stumbling blocks here that led to the downfall for some students was just the lack of being able to show their methodology concisely, logically. That obviously meant that the working felt a little bit messy, and so I think students are making arithmetic errors because they can't, they sometimes get so lost in all of their working out that there's numbers everywhere, and they make some errors. So the advice from the examining team is to maybe work with these multi-step questions, but maybe get them to use like a methodical approach. Let's get some strategies together that allows them to practice the best way. When I was teaching, I would use a ruler technique, so not a clear ruler because they don't want to see through it, but the one line at a time, so that I would have them cover up the whole question, just read one line and write down what it is they could do with that one line. So they might be, for example, in this question, they might be adding all of those ratios together. That's a clear what first step. Then the next line, Tina gives 3/7 of her sweets. So she, they could do a little bit at a time. And the use of calculators. Students, I know I found this historically, but students sometimes are reluctant to use the calculator, which they can obviously on paper 2, and want to do these things manually. So that's the advice, you getting them to use the calculator, or even if they are using the calculator, some are not writing down that work to pick up those extra marks. So lots more practice on being able to just set out their work methodically. So another question I wanted to talk to you about on paper 3, I've picked out a couple of questions on paper 3 actually, but another celebration. I feel like I need like special effects on these, but paper 3, standard form, question 23 on the foundation tier, we saw an average of 2.31 marks out of the total 4 and 3.67 on the higher tier. Again, best performance yet. I did some digging because when we see some standard form questions like this, I think, this looks really familiar to a question we were asked in this way a couple of years ago. And it was true. In 2022, paper 1, we saw this type of question. So several parts. We wanted a positive power, a negative power, and then a calculation. So I had a look back and looked at the data, and we have taken a leap. So back in 2022, the average score for a foundation tier student was 1.18. It's now 2.31. And then on the higher tier, the average score was 3.20, and it's now 3.67. That's a fantastic leap forward in a positive direction. Even more significantly, what I wanted to share with you is that foundation tier students have gone from a 38% success rate on a question for part A1 to 81% success rate this year. So 2 years ago, 38% success rate on part A1. Now it's 81%. That's incredible. So again, whatever it is you guys are doing in the classrooms to really hammer home these standard forms is just phenomenal. The increase for part A2 has gone from 20% to 54%. So another huge increase. We know that students will struggle with the tiny numbers, they call it going backwards, don't they, when they're doing their jumps backwards in place value. But at least we know where the focus needs to be. More of those part 2 questions. Higher tier, yes, they are making gains. The margins are smaller, but they are improving. I think part A2, it's quite stable. But again, we're making progress in the other areas. I wanted to pick up on part B, the calculation part, because they can be really, really quite tricky. So for part B, it went from 69% to 89% on the higher tier. But we are holding our progress on part AII, which is just fantastic, and I wanted to share that. Going from the highs of celebrating standard form, I did want to pick out this question. You need to hold on a little bit here because it was quite stark. Plans and elevations. Yes, that's right. You can see an average score of 0.05 on the foundation tier and 0.38 on the higher tier. Now, of course, there's only one mark. I've picked out part A. So this is not asking students to draw their elevation, but to find out why Rana is incorrect. There was only this 5% success rate on the foundation tier and 38% success rate because many were just not able to articulate or get across the fact that the height of it is the perpendicular height. And so I've picked out again some basic answers, some common misconception answers that we found. We did see a lot of students say, well, it is incorrect because as it's slanted, it would be a bit shorter, which is absolutely fine. Students did mistake the side elevation as being the plan, which you can see in that second student description there. Shows that the width is 4, but it's actually 6. So they were taking it as the plan. And some also claimed that the diagram should be drawn as a parallelogram. So not being able to see the orientation from side views. Now, this will go back to, and I know some of us struggle with manipulatives or having the materials involved, but this is where physical things in the lesson will really help with what students see. If you've got cubes, I know it won't help on a triangular prism, but cubes, or getting them to bring something in where they can draw the side of it, look at it from a plan. Obviously there are lots of other computer programs that you can help. GeoGebra, for example, is really good. To be able to rotate the shapes, and they can have a look at if you haven't got the physical items. But I know some foundation tier students would benefit from some geometric shapes, which might help. But I wanted to share that with you because it was stark. This is a real life. What can you see? And they just weren't able to articulate very successfully. Right, let's move on to the first 5. So on the foundation tier, we have the first 5 questions, and historically they are worth 1 mark each. It's a great way for students to access the papers, gives them a little confidence boost. And off the back of this, we've created some resources. So on your pack, the resources pack, you should be able to click on this 1 marker starter image on the right hand side, and it will link you straight to the cabinet where you can find those starters. So we have taken all of those 1 marker starter questions over the past 8 years, 9 years, and we've jumbled them all up and just made them like a starter. So 10 quick questions at the start of your lesson. Some teachers use it once every couple of weeks for homework. They're in PDF version, the solutions are there. I used to do things like this and have them printed out, kind of 4 to a page or 2 to a page or something, and the students would collect it on the way in so they could get straight down to it, kind of 10-minute starter, for example. And it's just that practice over and over and over, so they hopefully don't lose too many marks on the first couple of questions. So please do use those. If you haven't heard of those yet, but they're there as an additional resource to help. Let's have a look at paper 1. So I put a little box at the bottom to tell you the mean percentage outcome for each of the questions, and I've done a little snippet of what the questions were to remind us. Paper 1 was the least successful start when comparing these first 5 questions. We saw an average of 65% of these 5 marks picked up across the foundation tier. And I think by looking at those statistics in front of us, we can quite quickly see which one caused the biggest problem. And I think what it is, we had this last year with a stark outcome on the area and perimeter of a square gridded shape. Students couldn't get the area of or the perimeter, the wrong way around, of a gridded shape. And lots of teachers just said, I just thought they knew it. I didn't think I would have to have gone through counting squares for area or, counting edges. I just thought they would know it. And I wonder if the same is here. Question 3, the type of angle, we saw lots of acutes and obtuses. Students were just throwing down the name of the angles they kind of were more familiar to them, and reflex obviously wasn't one that was coming up too often. So question 3 did cause the problem on the overall performance of the first 5 questions, but we're seeing over 70% on the majority of the others. I mean, it's nice to see over 80% success rate on these types of questions. The examiner reports, by the way, will give you the full breakdown as to what's going on here, what they saw, what the biggest challenges were. But in summary, question 1, students are pretty good at rounding. They've been doing it since primary school. They're very good at that. Question 2 identified that decimals to percentages was the greatest challenge, because we've got another couple of conversions on the other papers. But this going from a decimal to a percentage seems to be the problem. So if you're doing that kind of conversion work, that's where the focus needs to be. Question 3 obviously was the downfall. We've spoke about that. Question 4, it was answered really, really well where students understood that place value concept. We clearly did see students just picking out, almost ignoring that there was a decimal point at all, and going for 1, then 2, then 3, then 16, then 21. So, you know, that was quite obvious to see where students were ignoring them. The most successful candidates filled in with additional zeros. So I think I used to do that with some of my lower ability students to make sure that they all had the same number of decimal places. So I would make them see that you've got 021, 020, and they would be able to compare them a bit better. The square root of 64, question 5 was well performed, 73% success rate. The most common incorrect answers were 32, students just halving it. And we also saw 4, so they were finding the cube root as well. So they were the most common misconceptions there. Paper 2. This was the most successful start. So paper 1, 65% overall of those 5 marks being awarded. Paper 2, 87%. So a huge change. It definitely was that angle question that was causing some problems. So here you can see nice successful statistics across the 5 questions. We always see the conversions of metric units to be the stumbling block. The millilitres to litres was better. You'll see there's another question on the next page, which is centimetres to metres, which is slightly better. I wonder if it's more familiar because students handle rulers more often than they do you know, in volume and capacity and jugs and things like that, but not too different. We've got a 72% success rate here in comparison to 74% on that type of question on the next paper. But students, question 1, absolutely accessible, you know, 96% outcome of students are ranging from negative to positive in that example. We spoke about question 2, students just not understanding how many millilitres there are in a litre, you know, dividing by 100 rather than 1,000, for example, was quite common, timesing by 1,000, you know, kind of going the other way. And as we mentioned with paper 1, paper 3, we've got fraction into decimal, much better than that decimal into a percentage. Of course, the problem could just be the magnitude, the decimal, writing it as a decimal with the wrong magnitude caused some problems. Question 4, the most common issue is that the students found multiples of 7 that weren't between the 30 and 40, or students not giving a multiple of 7 that were between 30 and 40. And the last one, the algebra question, so many students, 86% success rate, were awarded the mark because they correctly identified that the 2 needed to go in there. Paper 3 then, before we get on to some topics that were successful overall on the foundation tier. So this is a 79% success rate on these first 5 questions here. So paper 2 really great, paper 3 great, and then paper 1 not so great. But that could also be, you know, nerves. It's their first paper, they're early on in the exam season, so, you know, maybe that, I mean, it's clear it was the angle question, but they could have, you know, nerves and anxiety could also contribute to the start of paper 1. But let's make sure that we use those 1 marker starters to help prepare them as best as we can. Here we've got, again, that conversion, this time a percentage into a fraction. So the most common error was writing the answer as a decimal. So they knew what they were doing, just weren't doing what they were asked. Question 2 I've spoken about. Again, students prefer, or it's more familiar for them to do centimetres into metres, for example, because I think they are used to working with those on a daily basis. Question 3, tenths was the most common seen incorrect answer, along with 3,000. So that was a stumbling block there on question 3. Question 4, a lot of students didn't simplify fully, and of course where we're after 1 mark, they need to get all of their variables together. So we did see a lot of 8A's minus 5A. They were just simplifying the first 2 terms. And then question 5, I did make a note to myself. Students don't like ordering fractions. However, we saw a lot of working out, students trying to find common denominators, which of course is absolutely fine. But I did make a note to myself, and it was, I wonder if a diagram would have helped. If they'd just drawn almost like a pie chart, really, if they'd drawn a circle and looked at what a half looks like. They all know what a half looks like. They all know what a quarter looks like. Hopefully they should know what 2/3 look like. And that could have helped. Obviously, there were other students putting it in decimals. They were putting it into percentages that can help. But, trying to keep it simple for the first 5 questions, I wonder if a little diagram would have helped them. And that was just a little note for me. Okay, now let's dig into the tiers themselves. So I'll spend about 10 minutes or so looking at the foundation tier, then we'll look at the higher tier, and then we'll have a look at some summary points and the grade boundaries. So for the foundation tier, I've picked out a few, what I call winners, just students consistently doing better, the responses being better, little things that I've picked up from the examining team that I want to share with you. So the first question, I try to go in paper order as well. So the first question I want to talk about is on paper 1, so foundation tier 1F, question 16. And we're used to hearing these types of questions, the value for money questions, okay? So this was a really strong performance. It was really good to see that the average score was 1.65. I'll talk to you about the differentiators, but here you can see in the corner, I've put that post-16 key topic. So teachers who are delivering GCSE Maths to resit students, it might be in your school, you might be a sixth form college or an FE college. This is one of those key topics, making sure that students are able to apply those fundamental skills in that real world context as well. But the key topic here is working with money at post-16. So I just thought I'd add in there. You will see this little logo pop up for those students, but of course across the board it's a key topic. These are the sorts of questions we recognise, we want to make sure that our students are very well versed in. So I wanted to celebrate this. The difference between a grade 4 and a grade 5 student was an average of 2.44 and 2.75, so really strong. These questions, as I've said, show the fundamental skills, the underpinning skills of being able to divide by or multiply up by, and then make those inferences. So the most common approach on this question were for students to find the cost of 1 battery. So they were doing 180 divided by 4, 320 divided by 8, etc. Problem being, we did see students scale up and want to try and find 12s. Unfortunately, some students doubled the middle pack, thinking that would give them 12, so that caused some errors. But we also saw students getting their division round the wrong way. So they were doing 12 divided by 6, for example, instead of 6 divided by 12 for one of the packs, the value for one of the packs. And also, like I said, that doubling the pack in the middle. But the performance is good, 3 marks up for grabs, and a grade 4 student got an average of 2.44. So great question this summer. The other one I wanted to pick up, it just brings back when I first started teaching these types of questions, and students just had very little concept of what the meters were, the electricity meter or the gas meter or the water meter. They just didn't know what it was, or didn't. So, I'd send them home and say, well, when you get home, ask where your meter is so you can see it. And it's working, this familiarity of asking these types of questions over the course of the specification, it's working. Students are becoming familiar. The reason I also wanted to pick this up on was all students who got a grade 1 or above got at least 1 mark. So this is an accessible question for all of our graded students. So students that are working at a grade 1 are still picking up at least 1 mark on this question. When asking them to evaluate their readings, though, we saw real struggle with the writing it down, trying to articulate what it was they were working out. Again, that goes back to that crossover question point about, working logically and methodically throughout. The pitfalls here, I mean, it was a great question. However, just to give some constructive feedback, students that struggled were reading the difference between each box. And I wonder whether the presentation of the boxes caused a problem. If we just saw it without boxes, 47241, for example, it wouldn't have put students off. But there was a comparison between the 4 and the 4, the 7 and the 7, the 2 and the 8, for example. So that caused a problem for some of them. For those who found, they've worked their way all the way through, they reached the final step and they didn't know what the concept of expenses were. So that was a pitfall for some students, that they misunderstood the idea of paying expenses. So they could have lost that final mark. But again, a nice real world topic, another key topic, because it's working with money and understanding the application into the real world, a great post-16 key topic. So a question that you might want to use if you have those, even down at, your grade 1 students, if you're pre-16, these types of questions for your grade 1, grade 2 students, making sure that they can navigate their way through this question will really help. Another question I wanted to pick up on paper 3 was the recipe question. And we talked about this last year. Again, it's a key topic at post-16, recipes. We're holding steady, which is why I picked this up. It could be that this familiarity and real world context is the reason why it was so successful. But I wanted again to indicate that we are seeing students from grade 1 upwards scoring at least 1 mark. A grade 1 student scored an average of 1.13. and a grade 2 student scored an average of 2.13. So it's like a grade 2 differentiator there. So if you've got grade 1 students that are a little bit stuck in that grade and you're trying to boost them up to the grade 2, questions like this are really going to help elevate them. The approaches, the most common was to half the ingredient amount and then multiply that by 3, or to find half of it and add it on to the 20 that they've got. We saw problems where students were trying to find how much for 1. So they were doing the unitary method and getting 1 biscuit and multiplying it up by 30. That's where we saw problems occur. But finding it using the half method was the most successful. Okay, what do we need to do then this year to make even more progress over our coming months into mock season and again into the summer? So foundation tier paper 1, I wanted to talk to you about this particular question, question 19. It is a key question across all, but particularly post-16 students. Teachers, like to make sure that their students are fully versed in their transformations. This year, this question was a translation. Obviously, we can see that some tracing paper will help, but the last time that students were asked to do this type of question, so I had a look back, June 2022 on paper 2F, the success rate was 11%. Now that's poor in itself, but this year it went down to 9%. So we've got an average of 0.17 marks on this question this year. Candidates correctly identified that it was a transformation in the translation sense, but they couldn't do the vector. They couldn't describe how far or how much it had been translated. The other problem is where they did describe it was a translation and tried the vector, it was a fraction. We also saw incorrect terminology. We saw moved. Obviously, we need students to use the correct terminology, but we have moved. shifted, transitioned, translocated, translided. So lots of different variations, but obviously we need the word translated. Now, what I wanted to pick up on here is I've picked out another transformation question in a second so you can compare the performance between the two. But this is where the focus needs to be, translations. It might be that we don't see this type of question asked as much as. I know that teachers do lots of heat maps on the familiarity or the frequency of questions. Maybe rotations comes up more. I think I did a heat map as a teacher and rotation came up more often. But what I think we need to see is a real focus. Let's do translation, 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 and make sure that that becomes as familiar as the rotation, because we are making negative progress on this topic. I think I'll leave it there. I think you get the message. But translations, it's where it's at. And I've already spoken briefly to the Emporium team, and I think it's something we need to do in terms of resources to make sure there are new resources or fresher resources or a training session CPD on how to boost our transformation outcomes. So watch this space. We'll work on putting some additional resources together for you. The next question I wanted to pick up on that stumbled me a little bit was paper 2 question 10, and I just, as a teacher, if I was flicking through the paper once it had come out, I'd think, oh yeah, brilliant, 2 marks in the bag, lovely, my students would love that. But actually we only saw a 32% success rate on this question, so only a third of students got this question right. And again, I'm trying to figure out what the barriers were here, and I wonder if it was because it was 3 times. We also saw students that used the initial, the H or the T, were more successful than students using the full word, heads and tails. And also the examiners suggested that it was the writing down, the listing itself that caused problems. Those that used brackets around their groupings were more successful than those that didn't or used commas, because the examiners couldn't see the difference between, a head, tail, tail, etc. So I just wanted to flag that one as practice on the listing strategies. But 32% success rate was quite stark. That's why I wanted to share that with you, because I think as a group we just thought, or we would have thought, that students would have that in the bag. So that one there. Again, you could use these slides with your students. Maybe tomorrow, put it up on the board and see what they come up with. And if they're better than 0.3, a 32% success rate, then you can tell them they're better than the Edexcel average. So going back to transformations, this was paper 3, and rotation, of course. So we had that 9% success rate for the translation. This one was 47% success rate. So we can infer our own outcomes here. Is it the fact that we practice rotations more? Is it because we see rotations more? But I'm giving you the information, and the way we address that, or the way you pick that up this year, will be I'd love to hear what you guys are up to be able to get your students feeling more confident when it comes to translations. You can let me know. I'd like to hear from you. The most common mark, the pitfall here, was not using the center of rotation and just rotating it 180 degrees anywhere, which of course gave them the mark, but not the correct center. So the other question I want to pick up on, I've just got 2 more, were the kind of definitions of circles. So 75% answered the question correctly for part A, but only 12% correctly for part B. So again, I think it's the familiarity of the wording. Has it been a while since we've talked about parts of circles? A whole variety of answers were part B, a bit like the angle question. They threw everything else at it, but not the one that maybe is the least familiar to them. So we saw diameters, we saw segment, we saw tangent, we saw arc, we saw all of it other than chord. So yeah, with a 12% outcome for that question, I thought I'd share that information with you as well. So the last question I want to talk to you about on the foundation tier was on paper 3. And compound interest, question 25. We are seeing a decrease in compound interest outcomes. This summer was a 25% success rate. There was a similar question. I tried to do like for like. Last year's compound, there was a question involving compound interest last year, but it was a wordy multi-step problem. So not very comparable when I'm sharing the information with you. So there was a question in 2022, very similar to this, and that was a 31% success rate. So we've gone from 31% to 25%, which is why I wanted to talk to you about that. As you can imagine, lots of simple interests were found. We also saw students that did the legwork. You know, they found the 6%, added it on, found the 6% of that one, added it on. So they did that kind of, real kind of, they didn't use the multiplier and the power, for example. For those that did use the multiplier, they got the multiplier wrong. We saw 1.6 a lot, as you can imagine, or 1.006. So I just wanted to flag that as well. We've got the cabinet on the Emporium where students can, or you can give to the students to practice the themed papers. So if you want them just to practice compound interest questions, there's lots of questions in one paper, so you can get lots of practice in with them. Okay, let's have a look at the higher tier. So we'll take 10 minutes or so to talk about the higher tier. So the first question I wanted to pick up on paper 1 was simultaneous equations. So let's celebrate simultaneous equation questions. We saw a 72% success rate, which is the highest outcome yet. Last year, we saw solving simultaneous equations graphically. The year before, we had a question, I think it was November 2022, that was like this. They had to manipulate both of the equations to find the common variable. That was an average score of 2.11, and this year was 2.86. Huge jump. Grade 4 students in particular are improving over time. So students that are, going beyond the crossover questions and achieving a grade 4 are getting marks on these types of questions as well, which is really good to see. So in terms of methodology, the most successful students were the ones who eliminated the y first, because it made the arithmetic easier, of course. There were quite a few responses from students who made multiple attempts. We see these students do it all the time. They just try and find the solution. I think X is going to be 1, so they plug it in and try and find the value for Y. Of course, that working was really difficult for the examiners to follow, but the most successful is to have eliminated the Y variables. There is, in the examiner reports, there is a lot more detail as to what common mistakes were made. Of course, we are subtracting a negative. That caused some problems for some students, but at least they can gain the marks for finding the common, for scaling them up in the right way to get the 6y. Okay, the next one I wanted to pick up on successfully is not necessarily a clear choice by looking at the outcome. We have gone from, this was a 47% success rate, which you might think, Nicola, why are you picking this? That doesn't seem so great. But the last time we asked this question in November 22, we saw it at 12%. So I wanted to celebrate the work that has been going on in classrooms to get students more confident when using inequalities and sketching them out, which, the first 2 boundaries that they find are going to give them that first mark, and then the next mark getting the region identified, of course. But I just wanted to share how much progress we've made, even though when you're looking at the data and picking out your own topics of intervention, or where you want to focus on as a group, as a cohort, as a trust, you might not pick this one out as a particularly successful one, but actually if you look historically how far you've come from the previous series, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. The next question I wanted to pick up on to celebrate were functions. I mean, I absolutely love teaching composite inverse functions. You know, students, I'd make sure they'd have their Weetabix before we'd start these lessons, and I'd brief them the day before and tell them to have a good breakfast before we do these. And it's paying off. The prep that the students are doing, it's like they're really rolling up their sleeves and getting involved. I picked this topic for a couple of reasons. The composite function in Part B has seen an increase. Again, I found a comparable question in June 2018, and that was a 61% outcome. This year was 73%. But also, the substitution into an inverse function, as we can see in Part C, has gone from 6% in November 18 to 19% in November 20, and this year to 38%. So we are more than doubling each time. So we have tripled the outcome initially, and then we've doubled. So we are, again, it might not look stark on paper just at the offset at 38% success rate for an inverse function substitution, but we have doubled that outcome since the last time we asked it. Part B, the most successful approach was to find g of 1 and then substitute that into the f function. Students that tried to find the expression of f of g, they're the ones that stumbled a little bit with the algebra. So just as a tip, if that's how you are preparing your students, obviously I prefer the algebraic manipulation as practice, but just to let you know, students were plugging in the number into the function of g first before then into the f function. Part C, the common error, they were putting the 4 into the g function and not finding the inverse first. But there you go. Some students as well thought that g to the minus 1 was the reciprocal, so they were doing 1 over g, again causing the problems. So with that in mind, I want to focus on where we need to pay some attention to on the higher tier. And the first question I picked out was question 15 on paper 1. Again, when we look back to the heads and tails question on the foundation tier, if I was looking at this question, I would be quietly confident that my students would be successful. It's coming from a slightly different approach, but I'd feel quite happy with that. However, 57.6% of students failed to score any marks at all on this question. It was a clear grade 7 differentiator. So grade 6 students scored an average of 1 mark. Grade 7 students scored an average of 2.3 marks. Very, very different between the two. So if you are trying, again, to get your grade 6 students up to a grade 7, questions like this are going to help them significantly. Many of the students that had knowledge of sectors of circles went wrong at the first step. They were using pi r squared or pi r instead of pi d or 2 pi r, and students, of course, they gain no marks. We're trying to get the arc first, so we need that circumference to get the students in. Some students assumed that the sector was a third, and some were using a protractor to measure the angle and used 130 degrees in their calculations. Those students, of course, didn't gain any marks at all. The hint on successful students, those that were cancelling down their fractions before multiplying, worked more successfully than those students that used the cancelling down at the end. So again, if we try and keep the work as simple as possible and get students to manipulate it as they go, they tend to not get too bogged down in the cancelling at the end. The next question I wanted to pick up on, 2H, question 16. Again, I'd feel very comfortable, quite smug, some would say, if I saw this question and my students were, had just sat that paper. The quadratic's already factorised for them. They have not got to do much. However, 31% of students struggled with this. We saw an average of 0.62 of the 2 marks available. When the question was presented like this, I was very happy and thought this was good, but the outcome was concerning. So we have seen questions like this where students need to factorise first, and that was kind of in line with those questions. Where we've seen a question where students have to factorise first, they were more successful. I think students are used to having something to do first. But this question, 55% of students didn't score any marks at all. I mean, the second, I've made a note to myself, the second bracket, it's almost staring them in the face. Unfortunately, a significant number of students had the values of 5 and negative 0.75 rather than negative 5 and 0.75. They gained no marks. Students that did get the correct critical values, then it was a 50-50 split as to who would then go on and get the second mark. They were using equals instead of their inequality, and some students even tried to expand the brackets and then use the quadratic formula, which became a bit of a stumbling block for some students. So I wanted to draw that to your attention. Again, it'd be a lovely starter question tomorrow to see how your students hold up against the Edexcel average. Final question I wanted to pick up on then from the higher tier was question 13 on paper 3. So the 30 students in class picking 2 at random, work out the number of different pairs. There was an average of 0.57 marks with a successful outcome of just 28%. Again, like the last question I picked up, 55% of students failed to get any marks at all on this question. 870 was the most commonly seen incorrect answer. It was awarded 1 mark for the correct start of multiplying the 30 by the 29 to find out the number of ways in which 2 students could be chosen, but they failed to recognise that their answer needed to be halved because of the order of selecting. We did see a lot of students using the probability trees, which also helped with the calculations when they were multiplying across. So again, using a diagram, whatever students feel that they need to do to help them. I have edited the question, by the way, to make it fit on the page. So I've removed the lines. So students did have a whole page to use if they wanted to draw out their working out. Okay, I have tried to summarise as best I can from the examiner reports and assessment team conversations that we've had, that examiners fed into us, so I can share with you what they need, what they would like to see the focus be for next year. I will say I didn't hear as much this year about legibility of handwriting than I have in previous years. That's not saying it wasn't an issue, but examiners didn't pick up on it as much as we've heard in previous series. So that's something to be proud of. So I've broken it into the foundation tier first. Of course, we've spoken about the stating angle facts or knowing them. We've talked about the transformations, but also solving equations and inequalities came up on the foundation tier, along with some key exam skills. So asking students to check whether their solution is appropriate, whether the units are appropriate before declaring their answer, shall we say. We have picked up on the difference between simple and compound interest. And there were a couple of probability questions at the beginning of one of the papers where students weren't quite secure in knowing that the outcomes for an event is 1, and obviously cannot be greater than that. And also students were not being very clear in the work that they would want considered by the examiner. So if things are crossed out and they don't want that work marked, to be really clear what working they do want to be picked up on. So for the higher tier, the list starts on labelling and drawing out axes correctly. There were a couple of similar shape questions where the scale factors came up a couple of times where students were not getting it the right way round. So the scale factor between volume and area, so the 2D and 3D difference of scale factors there. Again, they asked, I say again, they said this last year when we had the debrief, that truncating or rounding too early can cause problems as well. And there was a histogram question this year that caused students some problems. I wanted to pick up on the histogram question, but we've talked about histograms a couple of times, and there were other questions that I thought were took priority in this network. Of course, learning the necessary formula. We saw a lot of volume questions, and there was a really lovely area of a triangle question this year. So just making sure that students have really got that secure, the knowledge of those formula really secure. So grade boundaries, of course, as I said, you probably know them off by heart, but I just wanted to pick up and show a comparison between this year and last year. So grade boundaries across the grades have gone down slightly. We expect that, a change in a couple of marks here or there, but we know that the grade boundaries are very consistent. We haven't seen any huge fluctuations in our grade boundaries, which means nice comparable assessments. We hear from teachers all the time, our papers don't have any surprises, and they can prepare their students throughout the year knowing that the paper that they'll get at the end of the year is going to be familiar to the students. They know what's expected of them, and that builds confidence. So the grade boundaries are there, but of course you've done all of your work on that for sure. I'm sure it's the results day. I also wanted to show you these are all available, by the way, on the grade boundaries document that's in the Emporium. But I wanted to show you the outcomes by tier. So we can see that there are 31.5% last year and this year got a grade 4 and above on the foundation tier paper. We've awarded more grade 5s on the foundation paper this year. You can see as well 98.5% grade 4s and above on the higher tier. It was 98.4 last year. And we've also awarded more grade 7s and above and more grade 9s and above this year, just by the looking at those cumulative statistics there. Right, let's make sure that I can signpost you to all of the support that you will find really useful now and as you go into I don't want to talk about mocks already, it's still September, but you know, all of that support that you can signpost as we go up to half term, but also I want to make sure that you've got all the links as well. So if there is one thing that you need to do today, if you haven't already, is make sure you have access to the Maths Emporium. I've probably rabbited on about it quite a lot, but it's the one place. We've got over 24,000 free resources in there. You just need to go to the mathsemporium.com. There is a link on this slide that you can access via your pack, and you need your school email address, the centre number. If you're not too sure, it's the 5-digit number, and you can get that from either your head of department or your exams officer. And then we will just cross-check that account with your Edexcel online account, and then I will approve that. But in the Emporium, once you're in there, look at cabinets. There are so many practice papers. There are crossover papers, there are practice sets, there are AO3 practice papers that we call the bronze, silver, gold. So they are scaffolded fully for bronze, so lots of parts. For silver, there's not so many parts, and for gold, they should be for your most competent students practicing those AO3 questions. There are mock sets. We have one set of mock sets produced every year. We keep the latest mock set on under padlock, under the on the website. Try and get my words out. Because we like to keep it nice and secure. So mock set 10 will come out in January. That means that mock set 9 will move from the website into the Emporium, but all the previous 8 sets are there already. Shadow papers are there, so they are the papers, the live papers, but we change the numbers around a little bit, just so if anyone has naughtily leaked the papers on social media or YouTube, etc., they don't tend to have the shadow papers. They can't access them because they're in the Emporium. And everything else you need: past papers, mark schemes, examiner reports, etc. So I know I just mentioned revision, but we've got the revision programs ready. There is now a higher tier revision program. So this is 6 weeks. It's almost off the shelf. Lift it off the shelf, and it is a 6-week revision program ready to go. The higher tier has just been released, so go in and get that downloaded. There are trackers, there are task booklets, there is a structured list of how to use all of the resources that I've just mentioned. So they're all there. Make sure you've got that downloaded and shared. And the last thing I want to signpost you to is all of the post-summer support that is still left to be released. So the week beginning the 7th of October, just a couple of weeks now, we will have the new shadow papers. So those ones from the summer with slightly changed numbers. So you can still use the same grade boundaries because the skills and the AOs and spec reference points are all the same. We've just changed the numbers, so the grade boundaries will still apply. The QLAs, so the normal QLA and the enhanced QLA, will be available. All the new exemplars, we have a new style of exemplar if you haven't seen that already. And we have the 17th of October, we will have our marking guidance network, which is free. The link is on the bottom of that page once you've got your pack, and you can click and sign up to hear how to apply the mark schemes. We will talk about the square brackets for those follow-through marks. We've had a lot of conversations about that and how to apply the mark schemes. So please join us for that. And then week beginning the 18th of November, we'll have the reordered papers. They basically are how the papers really did perform according to the data. So when I've talked about 17% success rate, that's not going to be featured until later on in the paper because it formed at 17%. So the reorder papers are just shuffled to reflect their performance outcome. So you've got 2 of us who you can contact directly if there is anything you need. You have your subject advisor. She is in the chat if you want to get hold of her. She's in the session. Vicky Wood is our subject advisor. You can email her teachingmaths@pearson.com if there's anything you want to ask her, GCSE, A-level, anything. And she's also got comprehensive monthly updates, similar to our Maths Emporium updates. So she'll tell you what you need to know, where it is, what's coming. So she's brilliant. She'll give you everything you need to know. You can also get hold of me. You can email teachingmaths@pearson.com if there's anything you want to find out from me. But a lot of teachers follow me on Twitter and they ask me directly there as well. So anything you want to know, if you can't find anything on the Emporium cabinet, you've forgotten when something's coming out, anything at all, please, or if you're telling me how you're getting translations more successful in your lesson, I'd love to hear from you. So you can find me on Twitter as well. I will leave you with a little reminder of the podcast, the right angle. So if there's anything you need at the end of your day to listen in to some influential teachers, I'm going to call them celebrities, even though they're mathematician celebrities on our side. Dr. Frost has an episode. I've just spoken with the incredible Dr. Simon Singh, who has got an incredible program out at the moment. So Right Angle is there for any podcasts, about 25 minutes or so if you want to listen to those. So it has been an absolute pleasure. Please do make sure that you bookmark the PD Academy, the Professional Development Academy. and you can filter by maths, and you will see all of the events that we've got coming up, including that marking guidance. We'll be doing GCSE statistics feedback. There's lots to come, so please do make sure you've got that bookmarked. You will also get a feedback invitation at the end of the session. We always love hearing from you and what you found useful, what you didn't find useful, what you want to hear more of. So please let us know. Even if you say, Nick, I really want some help on resources with transformations. So please do fill in that survey. I will say a huge thank you for listening, for staying on the chat, staying in the session, and getting all the way through. I appreciate that is a lot of information. I will say, wrap up here from all of us at the Maths Emporium team. Thank you so much for all of your hard work. We couldn't do it without you. And as I said, if there's anything you need, please do not hesitate to ask. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day.